Although American slaves were meant to be free, Jim Crow laws and segregation prevented blacks from owning homes, being employed, and getting an education. It wasn't until November 2000 that Alabama finally became the last state to overturn its ban on interracial marriage. Although the U.S. Supreme Court had
2000? So as you guys know, we've started on a run, right? Just learning about slavery, how it came about, what actually took place in time of soul. Definitely raised an eyebrow to, right? So this is going to be 25 shocking facts about the slave trade you didn't know. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this video. Come on.
What do you think of when you hear the words slave trade? You probably think of the Atlantic slave trade. While this is one of the most well-known, there were, and still are, numerous other trades. Today, we're going to take a look at all of the different trades throughout history, with a focus on the Atlantic trade. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 shocking facts about slave trade.
Here we go. Here we go.
25. One of the first mentions of slavery was in the Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi, circa 1860 BC. It's worth noting that besides not having a written language, slavery wasn't too popular with hunter-gatherers because it required social stratification. 24. Since the beginning of civilization, post-hunter-gatherers, slavery has played a huge role in society, from the building of the pyramids in Egypt to indentured servitude in England. In fact, at the turn of the 19th century, an estimated 3/4 of the world was trapped in bondage against their will, some form of slavery or serfdom.
3/4.
23. The first large-scale slave trade was the Arab slave trade. It started in the 7th century and primarily involved slaves being taken from Western Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians have cited the Arab slave trade as possibly being the initial source of prejudice against darker-skinned sub-Saharan Africans that has unfortunately continued into the 21st century. 22. When most people consider the phrase slave trade, they're thinking of the Atlantic slave trade. This slave trade started during the 15th century and continued until the 19th century. 21. As with the Arab slave trade, the source of slaves was, once again, sub-Saharan Africa. The Europeans essentially tapped into an already developed slave trade and exploited it for their own purposes. 20. The Portuguese were the first to enter the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century. For the next 4 centuries, they would remain the primary actors. In fact, by the time it was abolished in the 19th century, nearly half of all slaves traded in the Atlantic slave trade had been shipped to Portuguese colonies like Brazil. 19.
And it's like we have like a skewed view of just what we were taught just growing up in school. We were kind of taught it was all, Americans doing the bid. And they were primarily in control of the slave trade, and it was all about how we enslave people. Well, not we, but just the colonizers, right? But to hear that, we all knew that other places, other continents, other countries, were involved in the slave trade as well, right? But to hear more than half or 60% were going to Brazilian or just Spanish places is crazy. All right, this is the stuff that we weren't taught so much in school. Let's get back into it.
Trade had been shipped to Portuguese colonies like Brazil.
That's wild.
19. Although most people think of the slave trade as being British ships taking slaves from West Africa to the U.S., this only accounted for a little over 6% of all slaves. The vast majority, roughly 60%, were sent to Spanish and Portuguese South America. 18.
That's crazy.
Most of the remaining slaves, about 30%, were taken to the Caribbean by the British, French, and Dutch empires. 17. This trade wasn't just back and forth, though. It was something called triangle trade. And, as you could guess, triangular trade is any trade that involves 3 separate regions. In this instance, the slaves were taken from West Africa and exchanged for cash crops in the Caribbean. The cash crops were exchanged for manufactured goods in New England, and then the manufactured goods were once again exchanged for slaves in West Africa. 16.
Dang, man. So slaves were kind of not even viewed, as human beings, man. They're just property, man. Just property, just value, just objects, not spiritual, soulful, intellectual beings. And I wonder what made people think, less than of the African country and its African people, to make them think maybe they're just easily accessible or easily manipulated or easily, I don't know, but I wonder what made them choose that location. Or maybe it was just a lack of unity within tribes, to give like your own people up to slavery was wild, man. But anyway, let's get back into it.
Goods were once again exchanged for slaves in West Africa. 16. Although the British North American colonies were not a major destination region for slaves, apart from the plantations in the South, the colonies benefited massively from selling their manufactured goods to slave traders. 15. Historians estimate that approximately 12 million African slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. Wow. About 1.5 million died on the ships during transport, and 10.5 million were sold into slavery, mostly in the Caribbean. Another 6 million were sold to Asian slave traders, and yet another 8 million were destined for slave markets on the continent of Africa itself. 14.
That's a huge number. I wonder if you traced it back, like as far as just profit wise. This is my thing about it, man. There's a lot of money moving around here. A lot of money moving around, trades being done. I wonder if we were able to trace the financial, I guess, background of where all this money actually went. I wonder how many companies that are still around to this day benefited financially from slavery. There has to be some out there. It's kind of like an unspoken topic, right? What businesses who are around in the last 100 years financially benefited from slavery? You know what I mean? That's what I want to figure out. Let's get back into it. 'Cause that's a lot of money, bro. That's
slaves,
a lot of money.
Apart from the plantations in the South, the colonies benefited massively from selling their manufactured goods to slave traders.
Right.
15. Historians estimate that approximately 12 million African slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. About 1.5 million died on the ships during transport, and 10.5 million were sold into slavery, mostly in the Caribbean.
Wow.
Another 6 million were sold to Asian slave traders, and yet another 8 million were destined for slave markets on the continent of Africa itself. 14.
And that kind of talks about a hard truth, man. Everybody's going to Africa for slaves. Asians, Spanish, Americans, they're all going to Africa for slaves. And you got to ask the question, what made Africa so vulnerable to this type of conduct? You know what I mean? Like, what was it that made it so easily accessible that they just 12 million people over 300 years? That's wild, bro.
About 4 million more slaves died during forced marches to the coasts of Africa. Since Europeans typically were afraid to venture too far inland due to disease, slaves were brought to the coasts to be sold by slave traders or opposing tribes. 13.
And that's the part nobody wants to talk about, right? That's the part I just found out about, I think, like last year, that a lot of black Africans, you know what I mean, were giving away their own people, their own family from opposite tribes, giving them away for after they go to war and they battle it out, the POWs, you know what I mean, they're just giving them up for slavery. And it's a crazy mindset to think about, like you're giving these people away, kids, moms, fathers, families away, and you sell them off, and they go on this boat and they never come back. You don't know how they're being treated. You don't know how they're being fed, taken care of. If they are being taken care of, you don't care. You don't know. You know what I mean? And within that, I wonder, like, what could they possibly offer you to make you exchange a person for an object, whether it be gold, diamonds, like what could they possibly offer you, right? This is crazy. Come on.
Coasts to be sold by slave traders or opposing tribes. 13. With the arrival of European slave ships, criminals and prisoners of war were typically sold to the Europeans for money rather than being punished as they used to be. 12. Once at the coast, slaves were held in large forts called factories. Out of the 20 million slaves who passed through the factory doors, historians estimate that roughly 4% died there, about 820,000 people. 11. Slave ship captains packed anywhere.
And that just kind of goes to show you how poorly they were being treated along the entire way. You got people dying from the point of, going to the coast to the boats, they're dying off, which probably means they're not being fed, not being taken care of. Then they're dying on the boats. I think you said 1.4, 1.5 million. That just continues to tell you their conditions. They're dying on the boats. Then they get to the port and they're dying at the port. I mean, they just don't care about these folks at all, man. It's crazy.
1,000 people. 11. Slave ship captains packed anywhere between 350 to 600 people onto their boats. The quarters were so cramped that the victims could barely move on the 2-month voyage across the Atlantic. Many died of disease because they slept in their urine and feces. Others committed suicide by escaping and jumping overboard. Even sailors didn't like working on the slave ships, and many died of disease. This was good for profits, however, as the ship captains had fewer people to pay. 10. Upon arrival...
So conditions were so bad. The conditions were so bad. You know what I mean? You got slaves just pissing and shitting everywhere. There's nobody taking care of them. There's nothing there to make sure that they have, proper hygiene, or they just don't care, man. So you're sitting in your own urine, you're laying in your own, your own feces, dying from disease. Imagine the smell, right? Imagine that kind of what that can do to your mental. That'll break a person. Obviously, you got folks, like he just said, jumping off the ship just to get away from the situation. They're willing to kill themselves, suicide, because once you jump off this boat, you ain't getting back on. We in the middle of the ocean, you ain't getting back on. It's crazy, man. Come on.
The ship captains had fewer people to pay. 10. Upon arrival in the Americas, usually the Caribbean, slaves were held at seasoning camps. Dysentery was the leading cause of death here, and nearly 5 million slaves died in these camps. 9.
I'd never heard of that before. Seasoning camps? What?
Slaves were held at seasoning camps.
What does that mean? So seasoning camps, I didn't know what a seasoning camp was. So seasoning camp is basically slave traders use seasoning in the colonial context to refer to a process of adjusting the enslaved Africans to the new climate, diet, geography, and ecology of America. So basically just getting them used to the new area, new conditions, and new, surroundings. So they can, I guess now they try to preserve them. Now they kind of care about them, I guess, or try to get them to where they want them to be. Let's get back into it.
9. Sugar plantations were the reason for about 84% of slaves being brought to the New World. The vast majority would end up in Brazil. 8. Britain's triangle trade between its colonies, however, was the most profitable of the Atlantic slave trades. This led to Britain becoming a massive consumer of sugar. It's estimated that nearly 1 out of every 20 pounds in circulation during the start of the Industrial Revolution was derived from the slave trade. 7. So why were Europeans buying African slaves and not vice versa? To make a long story short, it came down to one thing: technology. Although it would have been cheaper to enslave other Europeans, advances in shipbuilding technology made it possible to enter an existing market on another continent. 6. Plantations in the American South, usually less than 100 slaves, were dwarfed in size compared to plantations in the Caribbean and South America, usually more than 100 slaves. This led to high rates of disease in the larger plantations of South America. Death rates in the Caribbean and Brazil were so high and birth rates were so low that slaves couldn't be replaced without a constant flow from Africa. In the US, slaves had a fertility rate that was nearly 80% higher. 5.
And that just goes to show you the conditions, man. It goes to feed back into what I was talking about earlier. Like, they're dying faster than they can reproduce. The conditions were that bad as far as living. All right. None of the essential qualities you need to survive, they were presented to them. And they were just out there just dying off. And they got to keep that slave trade going. Got to keep that money coming in. Let's get back into it.
Slaves had a fertility rate that was nearly 80% higher.
That's wild, though.
5. By 1825, the high fertility rate among slaves in the U.S. led to nearly 1/4 of all black people in the New World living in the United States. 4. This also meant that by the 1800s, most slaves in the U.S. were much farther removed from their African roots than those in the Caribbean and South America. While slaves in the U.S. were 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation Americans, most slaves in the Caribbean and South America had been born in Africa. 3. Both British Parliament and U.S. Congress outlawed the importation of slaves in 1807. While Britain pressured other countries to end their slave trades as well, the internal slave trade of the American South continued until the end of the Civil War in 1865. This finally abolished slavery within the U.S. 2. Although American slaves were meant to be free, Jim Crow laws and segregation prevented blacks from owning homes, being employed, and getting an education. It wasn't until November 2000 that Alabama finally became the last state to overturn its ban on interracial marriage. Although the U.S. Supreme Court had...
2000? That's, man, that wasn't that long ago. Let's keep it real. That wasn't that long ago. And, folks try to, want to say, all right, slavery, it was 340 years ago. Why are you still talking about it? That 2000 wasn't that long ago, dog. And these are just the, like, how you want to say, the residue from slavery. This is just the last the speckles of discrimination you can place on a person and put against somebody, right? Let's get back into it.
It wasn't until November 2000 that Alabama finally became the last state to overturn its ban on interracial marriage. Although the U.S. Supreme Court had prevented Alabama from enforcing its law, the ban remained on books. 1. Although every single government on Earth has officially banned slavery, it still remains a huge problem. There are actually more slaves in the world today than ever before. By some estimates, up to 50 million people live in modern-day bondage. Most of these slaves are in Southern Asia, over 20 million, but the rest of Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East all have high levels of slavery as well.
All right, you guys, so that was 25 shocking facts about the slave trade. To be honest, there's a lot of stuff I didn't know there. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff you guys may have didn't know as well. Make sure you guys comment down below your comments on this video here, man. Very interesting to see, especially the number one fact here of slavery is still continuing overseas. Slavery is still very present in our current world that we live in. I think in America we're kind of like maxed to the reality of what's really going on, and I'm saying overseas and in other countries. We're made to believe in this dream and this reality that everything is going to be all right, everything's fine. America's perfect, we have no flaws. And the rest of the world is doing fine. But in reality, there's a lot of unethical behavior going on all across the world at all times. And it kind of reminds us we're not too far removed from our worst of ourselves as far as human beings go. To me, slavery is kind of like the worst thing you could probably do to somebody. Bondage, forcing somebody to work for you for free, not really taking care of that person as well. To my opinion, that's one of the worst things you could do to a human being. And to hear that that's still going on today is crazy, to be honest with you guys. But anyway, if you guys like the video, make sure you guys click like, subscribe to this content, comment down below what you guys want to see next. And until next time, y'all be safe out there. Peace.